Welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Bryan Clark, a senior fellow at the Institute and director of the Defense Concepts and Technology Center at Hudson. We've got a great panel today that we're very excited about. We're going to be talking about a topic that's been in the news quite a bit recently, which is supply chains and supply chain disruption and how to gain more supply chain resilience for the U.S. military, as well as for some of the major corporations of the United States. With us today to talk about the issues of supply chain disruption and resilience are three experts in the area that are all dealing with this from different perspectives. I think that'll be very valuable for us to consider as we talk through these challenges. Dennis Hodgkins is here. He's a director of logistics for AT&T Global Supply Chain. He's responsible for wireless network equipment demand and supply planning. He forecasts, plans for, and purchases equipment to maintain the inventory that's necessary to help AT&T's network teams ensure the equipment they have is available when they need it. He has 21 years of experience in the telecommunication industry, including positions in operations and strategy and planning, sales and customer experience, and work in global supply chain. He's also, which is relevant to today's discussion, a 7-year veteran of the United States Army. Dennis, thank you for being here. Jennifer Bisceglie is also here. She is the CEO and founder of Interos Solutions Incorporated, which is a supply chain and vendor risk management platform. It leverages the power of artificial intelligence to automate the discovery and the response to third-party risk in every tier of the global supply chain. She's got 25 years experience in the industry and is a sought-after expert. I see her on news events and in media all the time, so she's definitely a sought-after person. We're very lucky to have her with us today. And she has also been able to share expertise with the government through the Congressional Cybersecurity Caucus, the Homeland Security Government Affairs Committees, and the U.S.-China Security and Economic Cooperation or Review Commission. And then last but not least, Lieutenant General Duane A is with us. He is the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army, G4, is responsible for logistics policies and procedures used throughout the world of the U.S. Army's logisticians and sustainment. He's been a career logistician with 35 years experience and has had a large number of positions around the Army. Most recently as the Commanding General of Army Sustainment Command. He is also deployed and been part of U.S. operations in Iraq and Haiti, and also been part of the deployable force in Turkey. He served in the 101st Airborne as well during Operation Iraqi Freedom. So General Gamble, thank you very much for being here today. So thank you all for being here today. And I wanted to introduce my co-moderator here, Dan Patt, who's a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute, who comes to us from a long career in technology, as well as at the Defense Advanced Products Research Agency, DARPA. Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you to ask the first question and get at this issue of supply chain disruption and resilience.
All right, thanks, Bryan, and honored to be on here with this panel. And what a great topic, because 2020 and 2021 seem to have brought the term supply chain, this topic, into newspaper headlines and the American public's consciousness like never before. Right? What used to be maybe a topic for a specialized topic is now everywhere, right? And the American people, right, they start experiencing this with the beginning of these pandemic-driven shocks, and suddenly you can't find pasta or toilet paper. And now there's these more complex and more insidious effects that show up. One of the things I think that we've all been tracking more recently is automobile manufacturers and their, how they're struggling with supply chain shortages, idling factories, and so on. And so I want to start by going around and, if those are some of the public stories, some of the public interest items in supply chains, what are some of the things that each of you, from your unique vantage points, are tracking in this area? Are there other disruptions that you're paying attention to that maybe aren't quite as prominent, but maybe just as important? And how do you see folks dealing with these disruptions? So Dennis, I'll start with you. What about from your vantage point? What are some of the disruptions you're tracking?
Yeah, I just wanted to first thank you for having me here today. I think it's not common in the past that supply chain people were brought into things like this, just as you said, right? It wasn't a very popular topic, but certainly for us today, and what's really amazing to me is how widespread the disruptions are, right? It's not just transportation, it's not just electronics, it's raw materials, subcomponent shortages, factory shutdowns, all also exacerbated by the transportation delays that can disrupt any part of that, right? And so it really creates an environment of uncertainty of when we're going to be able to get equipment, and then really puts a lot of challenges in there in how you operate in a new model that's not just in time, not as efficient, right? But yet make sure that you have the equipment you need when you need it.
Yeah, absolutely. Jennifer, I want to turn that same question over to you. Obviously, you have a unique and broad vantage point. What's a disruption that you're tracking, and how do you see players dealing with it?
Well, after your intro, I'm a little nervous. The Italian side of the family, I just wrote down pasta. I didn't realize. So, we're seeing a lot. There's a lot going on, especially as we all gear up and watching what's happening for the holiday season. I think that from the Department of Defense and from a commercial standpoint, they're feeling a lot of the same concentration risks that are coming through the supply chain. Military, and I don't want to take away from the Lieutenant General, but I think probably feeling it a little bit more. And one of the reasons for that is because we have such specialized sources when we talk about military supply chain and logistics. And I think that becomes even more of an adversarial strain on the supply chain that doesn't get smoothed out with time. I also think there was this real awakening over the last 1.5 to 2 years of just the interconnectivity of the physical supply chain and the digital supply chain. We've done work with the federal government here in the States for the last 17 years. And, when SolarWinds happened, yes, our banking and our insurance company customers were using our platform to figure out where SolarWinds was in their ecosystem. But our government customers and Department of Defense, it's such a porous and interconnected supply chain, very incestuous, right? Our Navy customer found 50,000 different breadcrumbs, lines of ripple effect of SolarWinds coming into them through the defense industrial base. And, where do you start plugging that? Where do you have impact? And so I think that in addition to just the normal logistics concentration risk we feel because of the specialized sources of supply, the countries we do or do not want to do business with, there's also the understanding and the education. Technology has forever connected us from a global supply chain. And with that, you have a digital supply chain that you can't see or touch. And like I said, it's a very porous and very vulnerable. And where do you even start?
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I hope we get to hit on that a little bit later. I personally find this one of the most interesting trends of this century is watching the physical and digital become interconnected, and how that's changing the economy and changing national security. But for now, I'll turn it over to General Duane. What about from the Army vantage point? What's a disruption that you've seen or is on your consciousness, and how's the Army thinking about that?
Dan, thanks, and it's also my honor to be part of the panel today. So to your question, one of the areas that we've seen large disruptions in, of course, has been front and center in the news. It's the medical supply chain, given the pandemic. What hasn't been in the news is the decisive nature of the Department of Defense. We had stockpiles. The Department of Defense had stockpiles of protective equipment like masks and booties and such. And we released those stocks to the government for distribution early in the pandemic. We're in the process of rethinking and rebuilding those stocks now. And so that whole supply chain, we've looked for efficiencies over time. And so we kind of wed ourselves, despite the fact that we had war stoppages, we wed ourselves to direct vendor delivery. And our assumption, unwritten, but clearly the assumption made in the medical supply chain was that we have a robust national industrial base and that it won't fail. And I believe that assumption failed early in the pandemic. Another disrupted industry that hasn't been in the news as much is the textile industry, right? The made in America textile industry that makes common gear for our soldiers, anything from soft body armor to backpacks and web gear and that sort of thing. And that industry's always been fragile. but it's been particularly hit by the pandemic because of the age of some of the people that work in that industry, whether they're seamstresses on the very tactical end of the industry, or you pull the thread all the way back to the raw materials required to make that sort of thing, the textiles that the Army and the other services need. And so what we've seen in that industry is just, we always knew it was fragile. That fragility has almost broken the industry given the pandemic. And so what we're doing about that, and we're thinking through, is how do we smooth the demand on that industry and make it more predictable for the small businesses and the corporations that are in that space, because it's something we need certainly for the long haul for our Department of Defense. So I'll just stop there and stand by for your next question.
All right, thanks very much for that, Bryan.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So that was a great opening, and it kind of raises a couple of the issues that we want to make sure we address here. As General Gamble brought up, the supply chain for textiles, and I think one of the reasons that the Army actually came to that realization was because of improved analytics for looking at their supply chains and figuring out where critical choke points were. As a nuclear submariner, I know the way we managed our supply chains was is probably still very antiquated, but it was very antiquated at least last time I looked at it. Spreadsheets and index cards. So Jennifer, how is the world of analytics for supply chain changing? Obviously, this is your bailiwick, but it seems like we're all, companies are having to really come to the realization their supply chains are much more diverse, fragile, and vulnerable in ways that they didn't really anticipate. So how are analytics changing, and what are you finding in the analysis that you've been doing with your clients in terms of where their vulnerabilities lie?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that happened, and again, the market did it, the world changed over the last 18 to 24 months, is that the only way that we can think about the supply chain is to demand transparency. And it's happening from an ethical sourcing standpoint. It's happening from an operational resilience standpoint. As the general mentioned, it's happening from a diminished resources standpoint. There's just no way of going back. I do a lot of these panels or whatever, and they're all like, oh, do you think this is, how do we put the genie back in the bottle or the hype cycle? I'm like, no, this is kind of the world we live in. And I think the general did a really nice job. There's only a certain amount of resources in the world. And some of them are the physical manufacturing and the textiles that he just went through. Some of it is technology. So this whole semiconductor conversation, it really wasn't a surprise if you look at the fact that manufacturing only happens in a couple of places. The challenge is you have multiple industries all trying to use the same components and subcomponents. You saw the same thing, and you mentioned, sir, the PPE supply chain, right? Not really a surprise, but we suddenly needed a supply chain for vials and for vaccines, and now you can't get glass for the alcohol store kind of thing. And so we just have a massive pull on a very small set of resources, and they're diminished. And that's just, the only way to get ahead of that is to have constant transparency and make sure that we're focused on alternative sourcing and what if. And so without getting into the very political conversation of reshoring supply chains, I would offer to you that I'd look at this a little bit more. When I got into supply chain back in the 90s, the US had just started offshoring manufacturing. Every other country was doing the same thing. We were all so excited because it was this whole new world. I have access to different labor costs and different innovations and different acts. I'm closer to my customer, wherever that is around the world. That's great. But, then we started building these very tight, just-in-time supply chains, leaning things out, vendor managed inventory. And it got us to where we were today, which is things that are very fragile and break. So I think, what's happening now is you can't go back on needing transparency. It's just going to be the cost of doing good business. This is not, I don't want you to go around me, Mr. Customer. This is really just, it's good business to know what your ecosystem looks like, both your suppliers and your customers, by the way, because it's brand and reputational harm. Like I said, it's ethical sourcing and sustainability concerns, but it's also resourcing and making sure we have operational resilience going forward. So we really have a unique opportunity because the whole world got educated at the same time to actually build back stronger and kind of change the way the world's doing business. So building operational resilience and really building in some of the agility we need, all through the lens of transparency.
And so just to kind of follow up on that really quick, in addition to transparency, it would seem like you need some of the tools to be able to take that transparent information and then figure out where the vulnerabilities might lie or where the opportunities for resilience might exist, right?
Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion right now about money being spent. And I was overseas last week, which one, it was amazing to be back on travel. Thank you very much. But two, all the discussions going on in Scotland and all of the countries signing up to really look at ESG and what are we going to do going forward. There's going to be a massive spend on supply chains going forward, and you can pick and choose where that is going to be. A lot of it's CapEx, a lot of it's around technology. And so kind of gone are the days of onboarding a new supplier or customer, filling out some paperwork, doing surveys, checking in with them once a year. Hey, how's it going on the phone? Now it's all around technology and making sure, when the Suez Canal happened and we all got stuck to our televisions and there's a ship sideways and nobody knows what to do about it because they're still running their supply chain on Excel spreadsheets, those things don't matter. The black swan is dead. As I say, there's tools and technologies now that allow it. And you literally, Bryan, you have executives that their compensation is being tied to the health of their supply chain. And when things like that happen, there's a massive cultural shift. And you have boards talking about this twice a month. So yes, there is going to be a big CapEx spend. You're going to see a lot around technologies. The technology exists to make it happen. And so you're going to see, we're going to get off of Microsoft Excel, we're going to get off of annual surveys, and we're going to get into continuous monitoring and artificial intelligence.
That's what I figured. Yeah, into a continuous management of your supply chain instead of this being an episodic effort.
Yep.
So Duane, the Army's effort in terms of supply chain analysis was something that Dan and I talked with the Undersecretary and the Vice Chief a little bit ago. What were some of the tools what were some of the ways that you guys tried to analyze your supply chain in the Army? Because clearly it's a massive undertaking, and you kind of have to decide where to start placing your effort and triage, if you will, what the most important supply chains are to investigate. So how did you make those kinds of decisions, and what were some of the things that are revealed?
Yeah, thanks. So we've included, and we've been at this for a couple of years. So just to be clear, that the pandemic didn't drive us to that, but it did sharpen our vision and our focus on things like business analytics and we call it business intelligence that we put in our ERPs, or enterprise resource programs. So the pandemic hit at a point in our Army history where we're doing we've embarked on the biggest modernization effort since World War II. And so what's that? We were using artificial intelligence, business analytics to lead that modernization. But then what happened with the pandemic, and I think what's the future state of warfare, is this idea that, efficiency used to drive our peacetime behavior, and Jennifer hit that. We leaned out our supply chains. We, just-in-time inventory, that whole thing that Jennifer covered so well. And then effectiveness was our method for wartime. So we had stockpiles. We weren't very efficient in that, but we were highly effective. And now we know that effectiveness has always been at the heart of military operations. So the big so what of logistics is freedom of action, sustained momentum, and increased endurance. And endurance really leads to the resiliency aspect. And so now I think we've had this awakening where we have to have efficiency and effectiveness coupled together if we're going to posture and to win the next war, because we'll have increased threat on our lines of communication. They'll be unsecure. Our strategic lines of communication, we assume, will be unsecure for the first time since World War II, and we need to posture for that. And the way we do that is through modernizing our ERP program. So while we've plugged in some business analytics and business intelligence into our current ERP, part of our modernization is to get to a 21st century enterprise resource program that has analytics cooked into it, so that it's not separate, it's not a bolt-on, it's part of our enterprise business system, which for logistics is a warfighting system. I'll pause there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and Jennifer's talking about the idea of continuous monitoring. So I guess if you build business analytics into your ERP, you're getting that ability to do the continuous monitoring.
Right. And at the enterprise level, continuous monitoring, but not only at the enterprise level, but also at the enterprise level, strategic, operation, and tactical level.
Yeah.
So by cooking in, requiring prognostics in our modernized weapon systems, then we can be both efficient and effective. And we recognize that all that data moving in the tactical space is probably unrealistic. But back to the AI question, if we can train the algorithms to understand the systems, then we can turn off, whether we turn it off or a degraded environment turns it off, we can turn off the sensors and continue to operate in that degraded environment. And that's really the endurance part of warfighting. How do we remain resilient in degraded environments? And so artificial intelligence is front and center in posturing us for that, operating in a degraded environment.
Makes a lot of sense. So Dennis, AT&T, I think, is probably an extremely challenging case of supply chain management, just because you're building out massive networks. You're doing this huge 5G rollout at this point, but you're having to deal with a combination of specialized suppliers and then kind of more off-the-shelf suppliers, and pull those together. And then you're also working with your network integrator companies that are actually building cell towers and systems in the field. What are the how do you employ analytics to try to get your arms around the supply chain management of a company like an AT&T?
Well, we started our efforts actually years ago to start digging into what our supplier base looked like, and so I remember when I joined the supply chain group about 5 years ago, we were already working with our suppliers to understand who their subcomponent suppliers were and where those long lead time critical components were being manufactured at, and was there geographical diversity there. So we were already along the path. And then when the China tariffs hit, right, we even dug into it more because we realized we had a lot of stuff in China. We wanted to get more geographically diverse. And so we were already well on our way, and then the pandemic hit. And I think the efforts that we were already undergoing, the pandemic has just helped put a lot more energy behind them, right? And a lot more focus on them and a lot more executive support. So things like that. Jennifer had mentioned the importance of transparency, right? And that constant communication. I mean, the interaction we have with our suppliers today is much different than it was 5 years ago, and more robust than it was even a couple of years ago. We're sharing forecasts well into the future. We're expecting them to be very transparent in any risk that comes up. And they've all gotten much better at that, I think, as a result of the pandemic. And we realize how dependent we are on each other. Another aspect that was mentioned is, supply chains haven't been the place to spend a lot of money. They've been looking at a way to reduce costs, right? Whether it be just in time and whatnot. So there wasn't a lot of investment in necessarily improving supply chain infrastructure either, and the software that goes with it. There's been a lot of great advancements in that area. So, tools that have AI built into them and are very configurable instead of requiring customization. And so the modernization of tools for us is very important. And this has helped accelerate the advancement of that, right? So that we have better visibility into when we're going to have challenges, where challenges exist, and how to mitigate against those earlier. I think what's real important too is that without those kind of tools, you're really in a position where it's hard to do a surgical kind of approach to different items and segment out products based on risks associated with them. When you start to get more advanced tooling, then you can really get surgical in how you treat different products different way, and whether they're sole sourced or off the shelf type products. So that's where our efforts are and have been, and I think will continue to be.
Yeah, clearly it's going to be a massive analytic effort to be able to guide the mitigation and the resilience strategies that we might want to undertake. I think Dan Barry wants to talk about that. So Dan, over to you.
So I've followed this analytics discussion, and it's clear that along with the modern era, the digital era, both creating more challenges of in coupling of supply chains, right? It also creates the opportunities with the analytics. We've talked about sort of these broad ideas about maybe working towards resilience, working towards continuous evaluation based on these principles of visibility and transparency. But I want to zoom in and try to understand what are the concrete tactical actions that companies can take or the Army can take to actually improve their resilience to shocks, et cetera. Like, for example, we're all tracking automotive chip shortage. And at one level, this sounds like, how hard could this be? This is just matching supply to demand. Well, when you look a little closer, right, there's all these choices in product design that the automakers are using, right? They source chips, the cheapest chips, from really old processes built on 200 millimeter fabs with big node sizes that were, it's a choice driven by efficiency. And now, right, to recover, they probably have to change their product design, maybe change the nature of their relationship with the suppliers. And all of that takes a long time. So it seems to be a really complex process. So I'm trying to zoom in and try to understand, like, concretely, how are people fixing this? How do they make that actionable? And, Dennis, I think I'll start with you. Can you give us just some tangible examples of the things AT&T is doing that are improving its posture?
Yeah, I think some steps we've taken that have been really instrumental in our success so far, right? First was, when I started this position that I'm in now, it was February 1st of 2020. So it was right when the pandemic was starting in China, right? And I remember it was 2 weeks before I officially started, right after the announcement, we were reaching out to every critical supplier we had to identify what was going on, right? Get that communication going, understanding the impacts of it. And from there, we just built on that importance of frequent and transparent communication with our suppliers, right? So we've already talked about that a little bit, but I think after that, it's really about the forecasting, right? In order to make sure that you're going to have supply available, you have to be delivering accurate forecasts to your suppliers, but it's not, short-term kind of 6-month type forecasts anymore. It's increasing those forecasts to 12, 18, 24 months into the future, right? And realizing that if you have unforecasted demand that suddenly spikes it up, you're probably going to be waiting longer than you ever did before, right? Especially in this environment, but maybe well into the future. So getting much more accurate in forecasting. In the past, when you were just in time, you probably didn't place orders as far out into the future, right? Because you were trying to wait until you actually saw the demand. But placing those commitments with suppliers further into the future and identifying, what the right spot is there is another thing we're deploying. And then when we look at our supplier base, right, it's making sure we're diverse both geographically and with multiple suppliers where appropriate, but also working with our suppliers to do the same, right? Making sure that they're getting that diversity in both their number of suppliers and where their geographic supply is coming from, where it's coming from geographically. So it's those actions in my world that we're working on to make sure that we keep a robust supply chain and supply availability at AT&T.
Yeah, thanks for that. Duane, I'm struck by that description of from Dennis talking about AT&T trying to work down the tiers in supply chain. And I want to ask how the Army thinks about this, because this is certainly one of the challenges that comes to my mind, is how difficult it is in the government to see deeply into the supply chain when you typically just have prime contractor contracts and control and visibility. How's the Army dealing with mitigation? What are the best mitigation strategies you've seen? Is it hardening? Is it multi-sourcing? Talk us through that.
Yeah, thank you. So we clearly partnered with industry to look deeper than you just described into the supply chain, to second and third tier suppliers, to understand where our vulnerabilities exist. What we're doing about it, first I'll speak to the modernization efforts. I in fact, just this week, earlier this week, I spent time at Yuma Proving Grounds where the Army executed something we call Project Convergence 21. It's the second iteration of this Project Convergence, which is our campaign on learning, as to modernize the Army. And dead center in the middle of that is sustainment, right? How do we sustain these systems? And out there in Project Convergence are deliberate, to get to your question about what's the Army doing with the, with tactile examples of what we're doing. We're deliberately training and experimenting in degraded environments and denied environments, and then requiring our systems, both our ERP systems and the combat systems that our ERPs help us sustain, is deliberately requiring those systems to continue operating in either a network denied environment or a GPS denied environment. And they're doing that as a matter of routine. So what we learn out of that, and then we cycle back to industry on what we need industry to do, help us do. One of the, I think, fairly recent innovations is digital twins. So the industry for our new weapon systems and frankly, some of our legacy weapon systems like our Black Hawk helicopter that's been around for over 3 decades, we have digital twins of those systems now that enable AI and enable us to then, work deep into the supply chains that feed them. The other thing, the last thing I'll mention, I'll pause, is what we're doing for our new systems is deliberately designing them for increased commonality, increased use of advanced manufacturing, sometimes at the tactical edge of the battlefield, and deliberately designing for those two things in order to reduce demand on the supply chain. And so it doesn't fix the supply chain, but optimizes the supply chain that's available. So I'll pause there and stand by for any other questions.
Yeah, that's really useful. It helps me, visualize improvement taking place. Jennifer, you have a broad client base. I'm curious what some of the more creative approaches, the creative actions that you see people taking to mitigate supply chain issues are.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about the supply chain is it's old, right? It's a really old, there's new ways to do it, but it's an old practice. So I don't know, it's innovative. I do think, kind of starting with the end in mind, which is what I think you heard a bit from the general as well as Dennis. It's like, what do we want to see? I think in the private sector and in the public sectors, was just, it's an enterprise problem. I think in the private sector, what you see, the change, as I mentioned to you before, is that you understand it's a real business problem. And to be very honest with you, our defense industrial based customers that are really winning the day are realizing it's a competitive opportunity. For them to be able to go to the general and say, I can partner with you and provide you the resilience that you're looking for. You can depend on us today and tomorrow and 50 years from now because that thing's going to be still flying. This is how we're going to do it, and not just throw up contract privity, which is where you were going, Dan, a minute ago. That's a real opportunity. We've had, not naming any names, we've had folks from the defense industrial base, literally the CEO of tens of billion-dollar companies on the phone with me to engage with our platform so they can have that conversation with the general. You didn't have that before. So I think that would become under the title of innovation. It's the cost of doing business in the world we live in. I also think in the private sector, where it's as much as these companies are big and global, it's a little bit easier to have cross-functional teams. So realizing at the enterprise level, it's a business imperative, it's a competitive opportunity, it's the cost of doing business. Now it's not one person or one department's problem anymore, because this is truly the what it's going to take to be a successful company. And then you start just getting into the tactical stuff that both the general and Dennis went through. It's the transparency. It's prioritizing what's important. It's monitoring. I mean, it's all the same stuff, and hygiene, for lack of a better term. I do think the difference in the innovations happening at the leadership level. I'll also offer to you that, here at Interos, we've been spending a lot of time on the Hill. You saw changes coming out of the White House asking for information sharing around cybersecurity because of all the ransomware attacks. There is a lot of activity going on with the NDAA going into the next fiscal year around supply chain and some of the transparency. And again, simply the cost of doing business with the government. And, I would offer to you that that's innovative. It takes a lot longer than I wish, but having leadership say, yeah, if I really want to do business with the government, or if I really want to do business with this contractor, this is the level of conversation we need to be at, and it's okay. I would offer to you that that's some level of innovation that we're getting behind.
Yeah, that makes sense. You start to see people reimagining the metrics. These mindsets shift. Dealing with this world. Bryan?
So that raised some interesting question about kind of going forward, what we should be expecting. And so, Duane, I think one of the interesting things that came out of what Jennifer was just talking about is the idea that the government's going to need a lot more transparency, a lot more of a view into what the suppliers and even the second and third and fourth tier suppliers are able to do and what their health is. There's going to be obviously forcing function, perhaps in the form of the NDAA driving this. Do we just have to get used to the idea that things are going to cost more, because companies are going to have to then, put in place the systems that allow for this real-time monitoring and transparency? And then are we going to have to look at more investment to be able to strengthen the supply chains as a result of that set of analytics? I mean, it seems like we're driving toward a situation where we're just going to have to get used to spending more money on the things that we buy through the government, because it's going to require more analytic power and more resiliency in the supply chain.
So the answer is I don't know. I don't know if we'll just have to get used to spending more money. I'm not so sure that throwing money at the problem is the solution. I do believe it's all about the data, and I do believe, to your point earlier, some of our industries and our Navy shipyards, for example. I'm certainly not in the Navy, and you know more about this than I do. But as we studied how the other services operate, I think the Navy shipyards are the most antiquated, like monks with ledgers, taken. But even the Navy and certainly the Army have had in the last about 3 years a data epiphany. And so data allows us, it's not about the ERP, it's not about these systems. And when I joined the Army over 30 years ago, we were proud to automate manual processes. And we did that for about 20, 25 years in my estimation. And then we had the ERP epiphany maybe about 10 years ago, 10 to 15 years ago. And we've been operating logistics both at the strategic level and the tactical level in our Army with ERPs for about 8 years. And the cycle of change is just, it just continues to get shorter and shorter. But I think in the last 2 to 3 years, we've had this data epiphany. We realize it's not about the ERP, it's not about the weapon system, it's about the data. And we can use different data tools, analytical tools, to help us see insights into the data that weren't there before. They were, to say the least, opaque, and now it's more clear what the data leads us to. So I think all that is to tell you this, that I believe that using the tools we have today, in some cases the systems we have today, whether they're complex weapon systems or they're simple other systems, in a different way, based on the insights that data give us, I think will lead us to maybe cost reduction, and partnering with industry to help us see those opportunities. And I already mentioned a few: increased commonality, deliberately designing it for advanced manufacturing on the battlefield, certain parts. Those will all help us. Employing technology to produce things at the point of need, whether it's water. And DARPA's working some really interesting efforts with the Army on that, or it's just energy. So I do think that while potentially the cost will go up, I mean, that's clearly a potential. The opportunity to use what we have in different ways to be more effective and efficient, I think, are there, and they're real. And sometimes industry, always saw it, and the services fail to see it. But now this more openness, this more true partnership with industry, I think will serve us well.
So that's interesting. So you could see situations where better visibility into the supply chain may make you, the Army, feel comfortable with the status of a supply chain, even if there's vulnerabilities in it. So there's critical paths that, are challenging, or there's a sole source supplier that's a problem. But you feel like better visibility into that could be sufficient, and you don't need to necessarily build out redundant supply chains for certain components. Just having that visibility may be sufficient.
So I agree, and that's well said. I think the old adage, "Let's not be surprised by the perfectly predictable," right? And that's what that visibility gives us. At least we understand the risk, and then we can mitigate the risk. And as I said, mitigating the risk could come in various forms. It could become, and Jennifer mentioned this, we could just prioritize, right, where we hadn't prioritized before. In some cases, it's about stockages, right? Whether it's war stocks positioned overseas or certain levels of stockages that we have in our tactical units. In many cases, it's not, how do we produce it, or how do we procure more, or how do we assure the supply chain? It's how do we use advanced manufacturing on the battlefield to produce it. So the mitigation strategies vary, but this whole business intelligence and data analytics world that we live in today, and in my estimation, while it's probably always been there, I think the Army had the epiphany about 2.5 years ago that it's all about the data. And now that we're there, it's making things look clear, and the opportunities are more clear to us.
Yeah, and hopefully the Navy will get there soon. We'll work on them. Dennis, AT&T has kind of a whole different set of concerns when it comes to trying to make supply chains more resilient, because you also got the potential of having to pull out foreign built, like Chinese built, for example, equipment, either not incorporating into your supply chains, taking it out if it's already in there, on top of all the existing problems with resilience and vulnerabilities. So how are you addressing that? Do you think it's just going to mean AT&T is going to have to spend more money on supply chains because you're going to have to foster the development of non-Chinese suppliers? Are you getting in the middle of this onshoring debate, or are you able to find ways to work around this without having to disrupt your current approach to supplying your equipment?
Right, so I can't really speak to what we're doing with regards to China equipment in the network. It's outside of my area. But what I can say is the general hit on a lot of things that I think resonate really well with me as well. And so as we improve or modernize our infrastructure and supply chain, and we get better tooling, it allows us to be more surgical in how we address different products. And with that, it allows us not to have to use kind of a broad brush approach in determining safety stock levels, or how we might mitigate a sole source versus a multiple source product, right? And so I'm actually predicting that our costs will go down as we come out of the pandemic with this new tooling and what we'll be able to do to manage the supply chain. I don't think that we'll be trying to be as just in time as we were before, but we can be a lot smarter with that surgical approach that the new data and the new tools allows us to do to actually reduce the cost in the supply chain.
And so you don't think that necessarily making a more resilient supply chain is a more expensive supply chain?
Yeah, not necessarily, no.
Okay, so Jennifer, in terms of like the commercial best practices that you were talking about earlier, and that you're working with your clients on, are you finding ways that actually allow a more resilient approach to supply chain management to actually be more or less expensive, more affordable? Or is it just a different set of investments that have to be made than we're used to making?
I think it's more of the latter. And I actually was, when the general was speaking, taking lots of notes, because I love that. Let's not be surprised by the proof. I had not heard that before, but I'm going to totally write a blog about it and call it my own. I'll give you attribution. But I do think that, again, it's the cost of doing business. And I think that what the general did a really nice job of is talk about what are the outcomes we want to measure, where are we trying to get to? And then after that, when cyber became kind of a thing under the Obama administration, and there was a lot of discussion about making it like the fourth pillar, I just kind of blanched. I'm like, it's not its own thing. It's not like it's a destination. This is really, technology's connected us. And so let's figure out how it is to run a business. And, the government, the operations, the strategic, that's all a business as well, because it's all about business continuity and completing a mission. And so this, and I also remember, again, when this stuff started being spoken about, whether it was cyber, supply chain risk, having conversations with our DoD customers, where they would go out to one of the major contractors and say, I need you to document your whole supply chain, which is just an utter waste because it's dynamic and it's continuous. And you want it to be, because that actually keeps costs down by not locking it into a single supply chain. But, just kind of advancing the conversation. What you're hearing now, and Dennis did a nice job, this is what business does well. It wants to be efficient and effective and self-healing and keep its costs down so it can be competitive with other companies. So by the government not getting real specific and prescriptive about this and partnering with industry and saying, hey, industry, this is the outcome I need. This is when I need to have the right product in the right place at the right time. Let's figure out what the price is that I can withstand. Industry is going to figure it out. And that's really the power of what we do well. You have executives that are paid to do that. And so, no, this should not be, if you want supply chain risk, sir, it's going to cost you an extra $1 million a year. That's not what we should be accepting. We should be looking at this as the cost of doing business. And oh, by the way, if somebody wants to charge you an extra $1 million, there's going to be somebody next to you that will give you that same measured outcome that we agreed to for a different price because they want the partnership and the opportunity.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, once you get the data and the analytics and you're doing the real-time monitoring, you should make that a competitive advantage. It should be a way for you to just differentiate yourself from a company that's maybe less advanced in how they're managing their supply chains. We're kind of at the end of our time. So I wanted to thank you all for being here. So Jennifer Bisceglie, thank you very much from Interos, Dennis Hodgkins from AT&T, and General Duane A from the U.S. Army G4. Thank you all for being here today. This is a fantastic discussion. I'd like to also thank Dan Patt, who is co-hosting here with me today. Thank you, Dan. I appreciate your all being here, and also thank you to Maureen Courtney, who produced this event. So appreciate it, and thank you from the Hudson Institute. And until next time, have a great day.